Welcome to Mission Ignition, a new leadership development podcast from Catalyzer and Catalyzer Media, organized to introduce you to our team and approach to igniting leadership growth in your organization. I'm Steve Ingalls, President and CEO at Catalyzer, and we're excited to share another episode with you. Good afternoon. I'm excited to be joined by a couple of people that I think can lend a lot of credibility to this conversation. But first, I think it's important that we set just a tad bit of context for what we're going to talk about. As many of you are aware, there's a tragic school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, in 2022. And maybe the best way to articulate or the best way to talk about that, just from a framework, an overarching framework, is to read to you a bit of the paragraphs, the lead paragraphs in the summary from the Department of Justice's criminal investigation report. So bear with me, but I think this is important. On May 24, 2022, a mass shooting occurred at the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. It shook the nation. With just 2 days left in the school year, a former student armed with an AR-15 style assault rifle took the lives of 19 students and 2 teachers, physically injured at least 17 others, and left countless families, friends, and community grief-stricken for their unimaginable loss. In the aftermath of that tragedy, significant public criticism of the law enforcement response to the shooting occurred, and at the request of Uvalde Mayor Don McLaughlin, the U.S. Department of Justice announced in late May that it would conduct a critical incident review of the law enforcement response to the mass shooting. Recognizing that, and this is quote, "nothing can undo the pain that has been inflicted on the loved ones of the victims, the survivors, and the entire community of Uvalde," the Attorney General stated that the goal of the CIR was to assess what happened and to provide some guidance moving forward. So our intent today is to pick up a bit on that theme, and with deference to the families, the survivors, the victims of the incident, to dive into and explore a bit of the lessons learned out of this critical, tragic incident. And I'm pleased to be joined by 2 folks who I think had that kind of credibility. Justin Smith, I met many, many years ago, served as the sheriff of Larimer County from 2010 to 2023, but began his public safety career in 1987, and then joined the Larimer County Sheriff's Office in 1991, where he rose through the ranks of patrol deputy to major, and then ultimately culminating his career there as serving as sheriff. He holds a bachelor's degree in administration of justice from Wichita State University and a master's degree in criminal justice from the University of Colorado in Denver. He's a former graduate of the FBI National Academy. And Justin, really, really pleased that you're here with us today.
Thank you, Steve.
Our second guest, Dr. Joe Doty, is a friend of mine from many, many years. He and I were graduated from the military academy at West Point together in 1982. But critical to this conversation, Joe's recognized for his contributions in various fields, particularly leadership and ethics. A long career, distinguished career in the United States Army, Dr. Doty has held significant positions, including serving as the executive director of a large Army unit. In the Army, that terminology is a battalion commander. But his expertise extends into academia, where he's been involved in teaching and developing leadership programs. He's known for his commitment to ethical leadership, often emphasizing the importance of integrity and character in both military and civilian contexts. And even more specifically, as it relates to what we intend to talk about this afternoon, I was privileged to co-author a chapter in a book that was published a couple of years ago entitled Leadership in Dangerous Situations, where we presented a conversation about the imperatives of character in these contexts. So, Joe, great to see you, and I appreciate what you're getting ready to help us understand.
Happy to be here, and thanks for the invite.
Sure. All right. What I don't want to do this afternoon is I don't want to get into a conversation around police tactics. I don't want to get into a conversation too specifically about the personalities involved. But the reality is this was an incident that was played out on all sides by people. And so I want to get to some of the leadership lessons. In other words, how is it that we can employ George Santayana's admonition that if we don't pay attention to history, we're doomed to repeat it, and God help us if we have to do this again. But how do we prepare ourselves individually and collectively for, no doubt, clearly the worst days of our life? So it's all against, this whole discussion is against the backdrop of leadership in what's termed sometimes as in extremis situations, or in the absolute most dire consequences you can imagine. The first thing that I'd like to chat with you all about is one of the critical findings in the Department of Justice's report was that at some point in the conversation or in the discussion, in the series of events that these first responders were dealing with, it seems they lost sight of the problem that they were trying to solve, which was essentially the response to an active shooter versus the barricaded suspect problem, which has got a completely different collection of tactics around it. So my question, and Justin, I'd be interested in starting with you, is how is it that in these kinds of circumstances do we remain mindful of the problem that we're trying to solve?
Steve, I think that's a very good question. And first, let me comment that this is a very difficult subject to talk about, but it is important, for all those that were impacted by this. It really becomes one of those that it's easy to get drawn in. We all know what it is to get kind of tunnel vision. And when leaders come into any situation, and certainly in a tactical, life-threatening situation, it can be tempting sometimes to focus on one piece and get locked in really in that OODA loop and simply lose track when one barrier goes up. I think this circumstance shows what can happen to individuals when they get that barrier up and are unable to think past that and move on to the next decision. That if the next decision point is there, and I think there's a lot of things that we'll be able to unpack in the coming time on this podcast, but it really starts out with being able to make decisions, move forward, and be dynamic as the situation that we think we're in isn't what we thought, and it may be tempted to get caught up in the wrong barrier, as it were.
Joe, no doubt you found yourself in circumstances not nearly this dire, I would imagine, but circumstances where it's easy to get tracked, as Sheriff Smith is talking about. It's easy to get sidetracked into a different collection of problems. How is it that maybe you would offer we need to be paying attention to? How do we maintain that level, in your words? How do we maintain that level of mindfulness when everything's dragging us away from dragging our attention away from the thing that we ought to be focusing on?
Yep, great question. 3 words jump into my mind as you're asking the question: awareness, awareness, awareness. What you're talking about, a cognitive skill. So you're literally talking about something that's occurring in a human being's brain. And your question was, how can I focus on what I need to focus on, rather than something is distracting me in the moment, and I need to be able to deal with that distraction and not be distracted by the distraction and focus on what I need to focus on. It's a skill. It just like any other skill we're going to talk about, or we can talk about later. It's a skill that can be taught, practiced, and learned. And so, and it's a skill of, Justin just mentioned the word adaptability. So you're training your mind to be able to adapt to things that are occurring to you in the moment. And as part of that training, you'll better be able to focus on what you need to focus on.
So, yeah, I do want to get there, but not quite. Yeah, Sheriff Smith, you and I were talking about some other incidents that you dealt with when you were still the sheriff, and it's again not at this level of criticality, loss of life, etc. But one of the things that you were chatting with me about was your service as sheriff involved a number of wildland fires that were in your area that taught you a tad about paying attention to the thing rather than getting distracted. I can imagine as you're paying attention to fighting this fire, which is, for people that aren't listening from Colorado, may not realize that that's a statutory responsibility of the office of the sheriff, for the most part, to fight wildland fires. How do you stay focused on that, or what did you do in those moments to stay focused on that versus what I can only imagine is constant chirping in your ear from citizens and other civilians and officials about, hey, tell me what's going on?
No, yeah, Steve, I think it's one of those, first you have to remain dynamic as things unfold. And as you mentioned, the odd thing is, when does a peace officer end up involved in massive wildfires? And we also had some flooding. We had just had a lot of natural disasters. And I can tell you, when something unfolds quickly, you can become overwhelmed. And I think there's a few different things that you have to look at. One is quickly realizing you can't handle everything yourself. You have to start delegating. You have to figure out what's important. I go back to that, for everybody who remembers the Below 100 campaign and that notion of thinking of what's important now, the acronym WIN, that we go in, we think some piece is important, but as the world around us changes, and that was for me coming in as a sheriff, I was prepared for the usual things that sheriffs deal with. I hadn't thought that wildfires were going to define my terms in office, but when we got into some of those dynamic situations, you had to focus on what were the life safety issues that are there. And I certainly felt that our first massive wildfire was in 2012, and there were just one thing after it. You thought you didn't even solve a problem. You just kept getting things thrown at you. And I did discover rather quickly in 2012 that you had to sort through what the important parts were, and I can only imagine what it is in that type of situation in the elementary school when there's just so many things coming at you. You have to decide which things aren't important to deal with at any point in time. And you have to sort through and throw those to the side and not get distracted. One of the things that we got into in the long term is you can't fight yesterday's fight today. And I think, in a much faster realm, when you're dealing with an active shooter, what you thought you were dealing with, 10 minutes ago, 5 minutes ago, 30 seconds ago, things quickly become not that important, and you have to get back to the important piece. And I think as I looked and read the after actions here, there was so much information, so many decisions to be made, that it was easy to lose track of what's the important one right now, which was that life safety and getting to stopping the shooter. All the other things become even as important as loud and the screaming and the noise and the chaos. That's still the one you have to focus on. And I think that's a lesson here, is it's easy to see how we can become overwhelmed when too much comes at us, and we have the potential to lose track on the most important, try to solve other problems that can be solved later.
Yeah, both of you have spoken a bit to this notion of preparing, awareness, anticipating, concentrating on the thing that's the most important. So I want to skip a bit in the script that I was interested in and move to a little bit of a discussion around this notion of high-risk, low-frequency events. And for folks that aren't familiar with it, this is a concept that we uncovered. It's been prevalent in risk management kinds of conversations in law enforcement and first responders, and it's been posited by a gentleman who's the co-founder of Lexapol, a guy named Gordon Graham. And I would imagine, Sheriff, you've had an opportunity, as we learned. He is not a name that is not well known inside your industry, inside your profession. He was talking about risk management, and he narrowed it down to the things that absolutely keep him up at night and that make him uber focused on what's going to go wrong today. And he ended up back in you have things that are high risk that you're going to encounter during the day. You have things that are low risk that you're going to encounter during the day. And then you have things that are high frequency, they happen all the time. And you have things that are low frequency that don't happen nearly as frequently. His notion is that the things that are high or low risk, but that happen all the time, are likely the things that you have a real rich deck in your mind for how to handle because you've dealt with them regularly. Even the high risk things. But the things that are lower risk are problematic, or the lower frequency are problematic. If it's low frequency and low risk, got it. Not going to happen very often. Not a big problem presents itself if it does. But a school shooting falls into that high risk, low probability window, and he complicates it then by I don't have any discretionary time to be able to sit back and kind of reflect on the next thing that I've got to do. And so it's a mashup of the conversation that we've had thus far, which is we're having the worst day of our life. We're encountering people in the worst moments of their lives. We don't have discretionary time to think through it. There's information flowing at us all the time from a variety of sources. We need to stay focused on the problem to solve. What can we do in advance of that moment? What can we do in a book that you've recommended to us, Left of Bang? How is it that we practice that mindset and that awareness left of bang?
A great point, Steve. And first, just to refer back to that book for anybody who hasn't had a chance to read it, it goes back to the wars we were fighting in the Middle East and the Marine Corps in the mid-2000s. And what the authors are describing was that the Corps came to discover that they weren't necessarily teaching tactical decision-making to their Marines. And they were expecting, perfect decisions and taking in all this information. And it was an interesting concept, and it really rang with me. Basically, what I took away from it was separating more of the strategic decision-making from tactical decision-making. And we think about that. And those that get in the executive roles, when people promote up and they move to positions of leadership, oftentimes they're taking on more and more strategic goals, strategic administrative tasks. And in law enforcement, I think of that, you're in the purchasing, you're building a new system, a record system, and you assign people some big project, and you have plenty of time to answer all the questions, and you'll be 95%, 98% sure before you make a decision on spending millions of dollars. And it is critical in those kind of circumstances to use that kind of decision-making. But when you move back to the tactical, and this is where when our people are in the field and in a dynamic situation, there's, I just think the typical SWAT situation or just a fight unfolding on the street, individuals have to move to that where there is not time to answer and, to get to that 90%. And you may be at 10%, 15%, you may be at 5%, but you have to make an immediate decision. And part of this is getting that mindset of being comfortable knowing what you need to know, making that decision and being comfortable. It's a reasonable decision. If we're going to wait for the perfect in these, and I think that's part of what I could read in Uvalde, there wasn't a perfect. Lord knows if you're in the middle of an active shooter, there's going to be no perfect, and you can make the best decision possible, and you still may have a bad outcome. We can't control that. And I think it's easy to get caught up in a notion that, well, if I make a mistake, people might die. Well, people are dying in these situations. We have to be comfortable making that tactical decision, being comfortable that happens in a few moments, and you make the best decision you can, and then you move to the next decision that comes on. So that's what I took away from that book. I think can be critical for those of us in leadership is, as a leader, you also want to look at who's best equipped to make those decisions. And there's a reality that there's people in the field making those every day. They're practiced at it. And that goes to the high frequency. if you're in the role with an agency of any size and you were a chief, you were a sheriff, you're a captain, you're probably not making those decisions with frequency. You have folks in the field that are doing it. And to kind of back this up in a way that it resonates with me, we're talking low frequency, high frequency. We can all remember when we were, I wouldn't even say 16, 14 probably, first got to drive a car. And you were out there trying to make decisions on operating that vehicle. You hadn't done it before. You hadn't dealt with all those things. You were low frequency. Those younger drivers have to make a decision about everything that they're doing. And that you fast forward to where police officers are as first responders, emergency vehicle evac operators who have been through that so many times, high frequency. You no longer have to think, and in fact, they teach you when you're doing the emergency vehicle operation, don't look right here. Don't look in front of your face. You have to look down the road of where you're going to be, and you learn to do that. And what we find out is that we're able to, because we've done this with such frequency, that the back part of our brain is taking care of that business, and we're just we know what to do. And I say that because if you think about it, we never get to that high frequency in like an active shooter. We're never going to be to that level. Well, I'd seen there are individuals in the professions that you gentlemen came through who fought in battles, and we can look at military veterans that fought battles all the time, and they probably got to the point they didn't have to think about it nearly as much. But in American law enforcement, civilian law enforcement, it's just going to require so much intent and so much training and practice, because you're just not going to have the frequency actually doing that you really have to work through these scenarios. You train, you practice, you think through it, so that, there should be almost no surprises. You should hopefully be in a situation you've thought through everything that can go bad and you're prepared for it. That's the only way, because you're not going to have the high frequency. And these are, by nature, as you described, Steve, these are extremely high risk. The potential for bad things is tremendously high. And so you have to be to that point. You've worked it in your mind so many times. You've done it in training, because you're not going to have that experience in the field.
Joe, you had a thought a few minutes ago, and it may not be exactly what Justin Smith was just talking about, or the Sheriff Smith was just talking about, but go ahead and jump in here and tell me what was on your mind.
Well, I was just going to give an example of this that most people can easily either relate to or have seen. Just think about someone at a college basketball game shooting a free throw at the opposing fans' end of the arena. And think about what the fans are doing while the person's shooting the free throw, waving signs, waving their hands, screaming at the top of their lungs. So, again, this might seem like a stupid example, but the sole purpose is to distract the person from focusing on the task. And coaches actually, so you can actually practice that. So that was my thought from earlier. And then I think Justin did a really nice job of just summarizing law enforcement by its simple nature is a domain where you have got to be aware of everything going on around you, whether it's a domestic disturbance or, stopping a car. I think in general, law enforcement are trained, this is arguably the social awareness category. They're trained to be socially aware. They walk into a restaurant, they're socially aware. They walk into a bar, they're socially aware. Again, I'm not in law enforcement, but my gut tells me that, and just from the work we've done with law enforcement, they are by nature going to have a bigger 360 awareness of what's going on around them in most cases. I guess the only cautionary flag I would throw up is in terms of, and again, Justin kind of touched on this, is their brains still need to be primed on this topic. What else are you seeing? What else are you thinking? Are you just looking at what's in front of you? Or are you looking at what's behind you, what's on the far side, what's on your left, what's on your right? So it's a constant mental, again, you're literally training your brain, the synapses in your brain to be able to do what we're talking about. It's not going to magically happen. If you don't practice it, if you don't train for it, if you don't talk about it, if you don't prime your brain for it, it's, for the vast majority of human beings, it's not going to be, It's not going to magically appear.
I want to go there next, Joe, but you used a term in what you were talking about that may not be familiar to folks that are listening. And it's a proper term, social awareness. You want to give us a little context for what that is, because it's not just a couple of words strung together in a sentence. There's a skill that is social awareness.
Social awareness is one of the 4 specific skills in the emotional intelligence literature and of the skills of emotional intelligence. Those 4 skills being self-awareness, self-management, which is about me, skills that I can work on, and then the 2 we skills are social awareness and relationship management. And social awareness, being socially aware, being aware of everything that is going on around you and thinking about it. So it's not a passive skill. None of those skills are passive. Self-awareness is not passive. Self-management is not passive. Social awareness is not passive. And relationship management is not passive. It's something you're either doing and you're aware of you're doing it, or you're not doing it, which is, in the business of law enforcement is not smart. And Steve, you and I have talked about this before in our dealing with law enforcement. Arguably, the very nature of law enforcement, whether it's on patrol or in the jail, in the detention centers, is all about being socially aware.
You both talked about preparing your brain, priming your brain, anticipating some adaptability. Let me push on that just a little bit. And I want to go back to Graham's model. I've not been a sheriff. One of the 3 of us has. So you can tell me how you're going to prioritize your time. I've got a bunch of things that are on my plate for which I need to both resource and train my agency to execute. Regrettably, school shootings would be among those things that you would need to be training your agency to be able to respond to. They would be the high risk, high severity, low probability things. But I've got all of these other things that are on the other side, the things that I'm going to encounter every day, the things that I need to be resourced to deal with every day, whether it's high risk or low risk. How do I balance my time so that I'm ready on that worst day, as ready as I can be? And what should my comfort level be in never getting there the way that I would like to? I could train response every single day to the detriment of something else. Right? How do I balance training for high severity, high probability events against the high severity, low probability events?
Well, I think that is an interesting dilemma. And it's not that you focus on strictly doing, let's say, the training for the school shooting. As I know organizations, you go into a room and pose the question, do you have a plan? Do you train for it? Yeah, we do. We have plans. We update the plans, every year. Agencies go and they'll do specific, I don't know of any agency that doesn't take the summer to go through and do an exercise with their staff. But the reality is those exercises are a culmination of the other training, the other skills coming together. Those tactical skills, the problem-solving skills, the communication skills. I would say responding to an active shooter is simply bringing those others together that a street officer is dealing with, I think, in most organizations on a daily, weekly basis, most likely, where they are facing something that could go dynamic and go bad very easily and very quickly. So I think when it comes to that, it's a recognition that it's a building of those skills. Those things don't stand alone. The old days, we had firearm skills, we had driving skills, we had arrest control, we talked about, de-escalation. These things all come together, and I think a variety of one scenario-based training is critical, and it's that mindset. A lot of it has to do with the mindset of personnel. Are they without being paranoid, thinking through the potential things that go bad, and amongst teams, how do they work together? How have they planned these? And I think that's kind of the key to it when you're going to have these extremely, high-risk, dangerous situations with very low probability or frequency, is recognizing that the way to prepare for those is going to be the day-to-day things, the day-to-day training that happens, that builds up to it. And it's still going to require, the annual or twice a year training going through the big scenarios, but recognizing these are the skill sets that they should be working out of pretty much each and every day.
Yeah, Joe, you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, as Justin was talking, runaway freight train hit me in the brain. I can just imagine I can picture a sheriff talking to a group of a room full of deputies and talking about the importance of the skills, the cognitive skills, the mental skills that we're talking about. And I could see them. I could picture them, the guys in the back of the room, and with their SWAT gear, thinking, why are we talking about this? Why don't you just give me my gun and we can go do some target practice, or put me in my car and we can do some defensive driving or some combative skills. Because the skills that we're talking about are they're invisible because they're occurring in your brain, and you can see them manifested if someone is not reacting appropriately. And so my point is, I'm kind of reinforcing what Justin said. Again, these are skills. It's a different skill than changing the tire or doing marksmanship training, but they are just as important. And I guess in some ways you might be able to argue they're even more important than the quote unquote physical skills.
Yeah, Justin, I was going to come back to you because your response is a really sophisticated response. Is that these building blocks that you're training all along are contributing to your readiness for that worst day of your life or someone's worst day of their life. But that's not the level of sophistication and thinking of that line deputy that just came out of the academy. They haven't connected those dots intellectually that way yet. What do we do to connect that dot so that on that day that I may need to respond to an event like happened in Uvalde, that I'm confident, even though we may not have trained an active shooter response in a school setting, that I've gotten the building blocks and that I'm ready to enter that hallway?
And that's an important point. And, tragically, oftentimes it's going to be, some of our newest folks that come out and respond. And the reality is, Steve, we can see oftentimes those folks do respond very well. I believe that's to a large degree because we focus on, the outcomes and support them in taking action. I think anybody that's been in law enforcement for probably more than 3 or 4 or 5 years has at some point worked under a supervisor or leader who they may have lacked a little bit of trust to support them when they were making the best possible decisions they could. I can certainly attest in my career. I remember a few times I went through that, and it created at times a hesitancy to act because if you're more fearful for what administratively might come down or the potential for what you might think of as failure, you may be a little more hesitant to act. And I think as we grow our organizations, it's critical that, one, obviously within a police academy, they're getting the basic skills and building blocks there. But what they also need to be learning is how to work under leaders or for us to be the kind of leaders that give them that direction, that support. And as they go and do the things, even the basic daily tasks through a field training program. Did they go under a field training officer who just liked to find the errors and the mistakes and point out where they were wrong? Or was it that field training officer who talked through a situation that didn't turn out, like they had hoped, and said, okay, so we'll learn out of it, and talk through those. What were the things that went right, et cetera? Taught them problem solving, also taught them, we're here together in a supportive environment. And for leadership, it's making that kind of an organization to support them, because the reality is almost every one of these that we've looked at with these active shooters, you're not up against somebody. You're not up against a special forces operator. You're up against people that if you can take reasonable decisions, dynamic action, you can shut them down. It's the vast majority of time. It's not being the best marksman, the best at every tactic, having the whole plan. It's having a reasonable plan, having a good skill set, and acting that we see that these individuals can be overcome. So I think creating that sort of a situation or that sort of an environment to work in, and that mindset can be the difference between success and failure. And again, that's teaching that leadership and giving them those opportunities to succeed and learn from things that don't go perfectly. And again, back to those in leadership, when our staff makes the best possible decision, they're literally putting their life on the line for the community, for people they don't know. That's the job that they took. Are we as leaders willing to put our reputation and our career on the line for them if things don't turn out perfectly? I think that's the dynamic role that those in leadership roll into, is being as willing to risk our careers for them as they are their lives for the citizens they're coming to protect.
Yeah, as you're talking, this conversation that you're having about making a mistake, considering that in the heat of the moment, it smells to me a bit like that's solving the wrong problem at that time. Your problem you're not trying to deal with is what happens if this goes wrong. No, what the problem that you're trying to solve is getting the thing that needs to get done in the moment, and then dealing with the rest of it, the aftermath later.
Exactly.
You made the point, Justin, about senior leaders, the strategic leaders, however you want to define that word, when compared to the tactical leaders. That was an aspect at Uvalde. You had some very senior leaders that were involved in the tactical activity in the hallway, and you had some very senior leaders that were outside, maybe more site command or incident command kind of roles. And yet you made the point that that senior law enforcement professional, that first responder, may not be the person with the iterations under their belt. They may have the experience, but they don't have the recent iterations under their belt to be the right person in that moment in a stack someplace. And yet, we observe this all the time. There's a natural draw for people who do what you do and what Joe and I have done to run to the sound of the gun. So how is it that in that moment that we meter ourselves to move to that place where we need to be in order to be the most effective for the ultimate outcome? Because we want to solve the problem. Well, it's hard in the heat of the moment, again, to know what problem to solve. And as a strategic leader, if I can go in and solve this now, being one of the initial people to show up on scene, I'm probably going to be in the hallway. And at some point, maybe that's the right place for me to be, and maybe it's not the right place for me to be. Talk me through that, if you could.
Well, I think what you're describing there, Steve, is you're right. We do, by coming through, your military career as a law enforcement, you have an instinct to run to the danger, and that's natural. And certainly, I look at Uvalde from what I understand that the chief there, was one of the first. I get it, but there's also recognizing the different roles, responsibilities, and skill sets of saying, okay, there's other people here that are better equipped to handle. As a chief, as a sheriff, where can I best support this operation? And I don't know, sometimes people get caught up in maybe not wanting to look like to their troops, that I'm not the best, I can't handle. Guess what? If you're the chief or the sheriff and you've been doing that role, you're probably not the best person there. Hopefully it's your line folks that are there. I think what you're describing, Steve, is that ability, again, to be dynamic and say, okay, now it's time to shift. Even if I was the first one on scene, if I was or wasn't solving it, especially as others roll in, command and control. I look at how important that is, because as this developed, it just seemed the situation got worse and worse because of the lack of command and control. Obviously, in the first moment of responding to a shooter, you're just flat going towards what's going on. But it's developing, it's recognizing that it's time to step back. It's not the same. What's important now? We've got other folks there. the leader needs to step back and set up that communication. Because what I recognized from all my time in the profession was we would go to that, and you're taking utter chaos when you arrive, and you're trying to make chaos. You're trying to bring order to it, which, in an active shooter is the action part of it. But a part of bringing some control to it is the leadership and communications. Certainly, there were plenty of examples during the tragedy at Robb Elementary where the situation was made worse by a lack of communication, as there were dozens and then hundreds of personnel there, that you saw individuals, go into a kind of a frozen situation because they're there, but they don't know what's going on, where they're needed, et cetera. So in that leadership role, it becomes critical that you recognize it's time to step back, and maybe you're not doing the direct command and control, but you're making sure that gets set up, that everyone's aware. There's situational awareness. Because of lack of command and control and communication, there was a lack of situational awareness. And as you read through, it's heartbreaking to look at, and as you read through there, the number of officers arriving who you could tell wanted to take action, but there was no situational awareness for them. They were in the beginning, not in the beginning, but in the front of where it was at. And it probably wasn't their role, but there was no plan. So you had dozens and hundreds of people who couldn't do what they needed to do because the focus wasn't in the right places as that unfolded, for way too long.
Wonderful conversation. Justin carrying the ball as he should be. Justin said something in the beginning of his comments just then and then he continued talking, and part of my brain said he could have stopped right there and we could have had a long, uncomfortable pause. And that was, and I quote, "Where can I best support this operation?" That is not subtle. That is extremely powerful words. And so imagine anybody showing up, sheriff, captain,
life rangers,
state police, the FBI, the Marshal Service. I don't care who shows up. And as we know, bunch of people were showing up there. How it would be fascinating to know, in the moment that they arrived on scene, were they asking themselves, where can I best support this operation? So I think that's, and that's, again, that's arguably, it takes a moment to slow down, to speed up. So you slow down to ask yourself that question, where can I best support this operation? So I just wanted to highlight, Justin, great point. Not subtle, it's not a tiny point. It's an enormous point.
Yeah, I get back, though, to the question, because it is counterintuitive to slow down in order to figure it out, especially when you're faced with what you know is among the most dire things you're likely to ever encounter in your life. To slow down? No, I need to go faster. And yet, how do we develop that capacity? How do we spend enough time on it when we're not confronted with these scenarios? How do we spend enough time on it? How do we train? How do we build our capacity intellectually and physically to do this in the moment when it's just not going to happen all that often?
One of the things that I'll throw out is, we talked about the training, and going through the physical skills. There's a lot to be said for tabletops. There's a lot to be said for going through those kind of scenarios, and it's looking at the big picture. I know we dealt with that in the major disasters. It was so easy in a fire or in a flood that was going on to get locked into what was right in front. It's when you step back, you slow down a little bit, you start recognizing some important things that are on the sides of the road, as it were, the things that need to be done. And I know as a leader, it's important for those who are the tip of the spear to have people lining those things out for them, recognizing. And I remember as a young deputy, some of the best people for us were some dispatchers in a 911 center who stepped back and anticipated what would be next and after that, and they helped prepare, and supervisors did that. And it's thinking ahead to what's down the road, because the tip of the spear is dealing with what's right there. And you're right, they also need to slow down and make sure they're paying attention to the right things. But I tell you, one of the things that I find very fascinating is the Blue Angels. I've had a chance to watch things on the Blue Angels, and they talk about how much of what they do to the flying demonstrations beforehand, they're going through, and to see them sit in a room with their eyes closed and focus, mentally be prepared, and they go slowly through what they're going to do, and they visualize it. And again, they're slowing that down, but in doing that, I see Joe nodding. This is resonating with him. They're seeing those things in their mind, and I think that's another piece we can do. Whether it's a big formal tabletop exercise where afterwards we come back and say, here's what we missed, and we pick things up from each other, or it's as a team walking and talking through what that experience is going to be like, so they can focus on the right thing. And I know when my personnel were going through and doing those school exercises, one of the things I heard as feedback was they had never anticipated what happens when the fire alarm, because fire alarms are always going off when you have an active shooting. It set those things up, and just that noise and distraction, to step back and focus and say, okay, slow down, think about what's important, right? And when you've solved those problems in your head, when they happen in an actual scenario, you're prepared for it because you slowed down and thought through it. So I think there's a real validity to the slowing down for what your roles are, so you're solving the problems that you should be there solving. I mean, it's a team approach. You need the tip of the spear, but you also need, and you in the military always need the logistics people to have the thing that you needed before you knew you needed them.
I'm thinking to a Sunday afternoon in Mesa County, Colorado, that I went on a ride along with a team. And the things that you're talking about, even going through the motions, just cognitively, it seems like that would be applicable even on a day patrol. I mean, I was in the car on several occasions where we rolled up on a scene, and it just kind of seems like you're checking blocks and going through the motions without rehearsing. Well, I'm going to pull up here, and this is what I might be seeing, and this is what I might not be seeing. Is there applicability to this mental rehearsal, even as you're anticipating the call you're responding to? Certainly there is in the case like we're talking about here with Uvalde, but doesn't it extend all the way back to just routine day-to-day? Because we can both count on a half a dozen circumstances off the top of our head the casual response to something that should have gotten our awareness up. Again, back to left of bank. These are people, these are Marines. They call it being in code yellow all the time. Just rolling up casually on a scene seems like a really bad social awareness practice. What would you say about that, Justin?
No, you're right. I think to have mentally prepared for it, when we talk about the slowing down is not like physical slowing down, it's mentally slowing down a little bit to make sure you're checking the right pieces, but you do have to be in that state of awareness. But when you've gone through and mentally prepared for any number of circumstances, there's not the unknown decisions that have to be made. If you've, as personnel have thought through that, and from the line deputy up through their supervision, have thought through what the roles are. And obviously, when that happens on a daily basis, there's redundancy, and they build that up. It's looking at the situations that happen with low frequency and mentally going through the different things that could happen. You've been able to kind of weigh through those decisions before it happens. And I think that's kind of what you're describing. I remember as a young deputy always being amazed that you would have, you'd have an in-progress call, and you worked around some other young officers. And what did you do when that call got toned out? You all raced right to the problem. And you looked at what we called the old timers back then, and would say, well, they're just not in quite as much a hurry. Well, they were actually thinking through the things that are going to happen, And they're not thinking about where it happened. They're thinking down the road. Okay, if we had this kind of an incident, the suspect likely went this direction. They're not as interested in racing into it, but they're thinking about the other things that need to happen, and from experience, the likelihood of things. And they're just, I think it's a little more playing chess with it. You're thinking ahead. Now, again, we're talking an active shooter. You got to get to the active shooter, but as a team, these are all team activities. There needs to be other things going on for that first team to do what they need to do. They need others solving the problems further out in the circle for them so they can focus inside, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Joe, tell me, the thing that come to mind, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, the thing that comes to mind now is that, and I mentioned our deference to action. Action isn't always movement. Action can be thinking. And if I'm doing the right thinking about the right situation, solving the right problem, now I've put myself in the position, rather than moving to the scene of the incident, as Justin was saying, and I'm standing off. This is the best place for me in this moment. This is how I'm contributing to the scenario, by thinking, not doing.
It could be as simple. I'm not being facetious. It could be as simple as some couple deputies running up, and instead of them running to the sound of the guns, they asked whoever's in charge, whether it's the sheriff or the on-site commander, what can I do to best support this operation? The answer might be, I need you to go stand over there and get all those people out of the way. We need a lot more crowd control going on, or I need you to make these phone calls. I need you to. We're going to be here all day. I need you to talk to, a local catering company and start ordering lunch for us, because we're going to be here all day and guys are going to be starving. There's 1,000 different ways in operations like this. Justin mentioned, the logistics side of the house. It's just another example of, there's so many moving parts. Who is slowing their mind down enough to be able to think about all the things that need to be thought about? Because it's not all 300 people are not going to run into that hallway and get that shooter. It's not going to happen.
There's a lot of directions we could probably go with this, but just in the interest of time, and to recap, we've talked about making sure that you're in these circumstances working to solve the right problem, putting the right people in the right place to solve the right problem, realizing that maybe action that you're trying to take is thinking rather than movement, scenario around what it is that we need to do in advance, even if it's just the building blocks that we're putting together during training that ultimately contribute to a more complex situation like we have here, and helping younger deputies and officers realize that that's what they're doing. They're training for the complex by focusing on the incremental. Joe, I'd like to start with you and then Justin. Joe, wrap up comments, some thoughts maybe as you think about this entire scenario, and what the more significant lesson to take out of this might be, if there were one or two.
I'll go back to my 3 words. Awareness, awareness, awareness. 3 simple words, but we could spend weeks, months, lifetimes developing the skills. And when I say awareness, it's both self-awareness and social awareness. So developing the skills to be able to be cognitively present and emotionally present in the situation you're in, while simultaneously being socially aware of all the moving parts in something as complex as an active shooter in high school. And so, again, these are cognitive and emotional skills that you can see being manifested or not manifested by a human being in front of you. I mean, picture someone who's just completely freaking out, or having a temper tantrum, or is so tired because they've been up for 72 hours that they can't function, that their brain doesn't function. So there's different ways to think about this in terms of focusing on the skills of self-awareness and social awareness.
I think I agree. Joe's got excellent points there. And for me, it comes back to that adaptability and back to Gordon Graham's Below 100. He talks about, think about the WIN acronym. What's important now? It's so easy to get caught up in what we initially think we're solving, and then that changes, and that we're able to go, okay, now let's make sure we're solving the most, because what was most important 5 minutes ago, 5 seconds ago, may no longer be. And this situation, we're talking about life safety. Okay, given whatever the circumstances, what's the most important thing I need to put my energy and direction into right now? And a part of that is we may be dealing with a situation and then realize what's important now is that I become more supportive than the action person. What's my role in here? So I think continuing to focus and recognizing that's changing, and not get caught up and try to implement the plan from 5 minutes ago that no longer is a good plan, and just being prepared to constantly adjust as the situation unfolds. And the other part of that is just that determination. You have to act, that in these tactical situations, the dynamic, the action is oftentimes, it's not perfect action. It's making a reasonable decision and acting upon it. That is what makes the difference.
Yeah, let me thank both of you for making the time. I appreciate the conversation, again, around a very, very, very tough topic. Our thoughts continue to be with the families, the survivors, the victims, to include the first responders who attempted to support what was the worst day of many people's lives. And we'll be interested in seeing how all of this plays out, hopefully with some more positive outcomes in other scenarios that look similar in the future. So thanks, Justin. Thanks, Joe. We'll call that a wrap.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thanks again for joining us on Mission Ignition. We hope you'll tune in again soon and make this one of your go-to sources for plain, practical thinking around the contemporary issues you, your leaders, and your organization are dealing with. In the meantime, please check us out on our website at www.teamcatalyzer.com and on LinkedIn. Remember, regardless of what business you're in, we're all primarily in the people business. Now time to get out there and ignite some great.